Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is David Shimer. David is a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute and is author of the book Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference. It happens to be a New York Times Editor's Choice book. David, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Excellent. So in trying to decide where to begin with you, we since we have a frame of reference, what happened in the last election, I want to, people who are concerned about election security, concerned about meddling, on a scale of 1 to 10, how worried should they be if 10 is red alert?
So I would say that I would broaden that question slightly. I think they should be extremely concerned about the security of this election by threats from both within and outside of the United States. We know that foreign actors, specifically Russia, are very actively interfering in this election, as the FBI director has said. We also know that the current president has alleged that the election will be rigged and that its outcome should not necessarily be trusted or deemed legitimate. And I would say that those two phenomena, which are very closely related and which are feeding into one another, make it so that the security and sanctity of this election are very much in question over the next 4 to 5 weeks.
I know it's very difficult to measure these things, but are you more concerned about the internal or external threats?
So I think, again, they're very closely related. It's difficult to separate them because something that I'm very aware of, for instance, is that 4 years ago, as the election was unfolding in 2016, Russian trolls were spreading disinformation about rigged polling places and impending violence. And on that day, as well as I detail in my book, the Obama White House was awaiting a potential Russian cyber attack designed to sow chaos and make the election seem rigged. So therefore, that potential for Russia to try to make Americans distrust the outcome of their election is inextricably linked to the ongoing questioning of the legitimacy of the election domestically, because the Russian tradition of electoral interference is to take advantage of vulnerabilities that already exist, to pour gasoline on weaknesses that we ourselves create. And that is something that Russia has done for decades and did in 2016 and will no doubt continue to do, not only in this cycle, but thereafter.
What do we know about the current level of meddling, whether it be Russia or perhaps other players, China, Iran? Who else is in this game?
So right now it appears to predominantly be Russia. We know a couple of things. We know that the FBI director, as I said, has testified under oath that Russia is very actively interfering in this election in favor of the incumbent. We know that Facebook and Twitter have announced takedowns of covert Russian accounts. And if history is any indication, that will just be the tip of the iceberg. There will be more to uncover there. We know that Microsoft has said Russian military intelligence is trying to steal the emails or personal data of hundreds of American political figures, potentially to then release that information, as it did 4 years ago. And we know that Russia, according to the US government, is amplifying disinformation around voter fraud and also around the mental health of Vice President Biden. So there are clues out there, but the trouble here as a historian of covert electoral interference is the full breadth and depth of these operations comes into view with time. Some of this information remains classified. Some of it, perhaps the US government just doesn't even know to this point. So those are the pieces we're aware of so far. And the last one I'll say is that just this week, a senior US government official said that foreign actors are trying to gain access to our actual election infrastructure, which potentially opens up a new line of attack over the coming weeks in conjunction with those other efforts I said, which are more designed to manipulate people.
With the benefit of hindsight, looking back at 2016, is it possible to gauge what the impact was? I know people as esteemed as Kathleen Hall Jamieson have concluded that meddling down the stretch, particularly in those 3 Midwest states that determined the outcome by 77,000 votes, was significant, that the impact was significant. How do you view that? Is it possible in your mind to measure it?
So I would say something history instructs is that with operations to influence voters, because there are two ways to interfere in elections: by changing actual ballots, by manipulating ballot boxes, and then by manipulating public opinion. And for the second type of operation, measuring precisely the impact has never really been possible, whether it's CIA interference in Italy in 1948, interference in Serbia in 2000, or interference in our own election in 2016. A timeless pattern here is that there's great question about the actual impact of these operations. I interviewed, for instance, various CIA officers who said they still debate how much operations they executed decades earlier actually mattered. But I would say that with that said, obviously there was an impact. It defies logic to say that there wasn't. Kathleen Hall Jamison's argument, I think, is extremely compelling. And beyond that, the second thing we have to consider with the question of impact is the perception of impact. Because something that I also found in my research is that when a foreign actor's desired outcome is achieved, so Russia wanted Donald Trump to win, Donald Trump won, the assumption often inside the government of the interfering actor is that we made all the difference. And we've seen indications of that in intercepted communications of Russian trolls celebrating how they, quote, made America great again. And that can give rise to the idea that this is something worth doing and worth continuing to execute, as we've seen Russia interfering in elections, not only in America, but also around the world. So clearly, Russia believes the impact is well worth, it makes this a well worth executing.
For obvious reasons, we're looking at this from the U.S. perspective, but critics of the U.S. would make the case that the U.S. has meddled in elections and that, this is payback on some level. What do you make of that argument?
Well, it's a matter of the historical record, as I detail at length in my book, that the CIA has historically interfered in elections around the world. Harry Truman, for instance, decided the start of this history came in 1948 when the Soviet Union aggressively interfered in elections across Eastern Europe, and the Truman team decided to respond to Soviet election interference with American election interference by having the CIA interfere in Italy's election in support of centrist candidates who the U.S. government deemed would help preserve Italian democracy in the long term. In the Cold War, the CIA and KGB went toe-to-toe in elections with different systemic objectives often, but the same idea of interfering in these elections. But I would say that equivalency is wrong for two reasons. The first is about those systemic objectives, where the Soviet and now Russian idea has been to support candidates who will tear down democratic systems. Whereas the American idea, sometimes flawed, but the idea is to support candidates with some exceptions, who will shore up their democratic systems, who will safeguard it in the long term, even if in the short term, this involves violating the sovereignty of another democracy. And the second reason that equivalency is wrong is because America has turned the page here. America has, since the Cold War, moved away from covert electoral interference, with rare exceptions. As I detail, in 2000, the CIA did execute a covert electoral interference operation, but by and large, this is a historical weapon for America, whereas for Russia, it's a modern one. Russia's doubled down on this weapon and is interfering in elections on a global basis. And I believe moving forward, America should ban the weapon of covert electoral interference, should say explicitly the CIA is not allowed to do this, because if we're serious about taking on this threat, about standing up for free and fair elections, and about helping other democracies preserve their own sovereignty, then we ourselves should not be covertly violating the sovereignty of democracies seeking to hold free and fair elections.
If this were happening in another country and we, an ally of ours, would we be volunteering to send election monitors? Is the situation that dire?
Are you referring to the current state of the 2020 election?
Yeah. If this were happening elsewhere and the U.S. was on the outside looking in, we've sent election monitors to nations that had concerns about the security of their elections. Would we be doing the same if what was happening here was happening elsewhere?
So I think that it's difficult to map out hypotheticals. What I would say is that I do not believe that we should presume that we are suddenly Belarus or we are suddenly Russia. That's not true. I think that because of the decentralized nature of America's election system, which is that states and localities, not the federal government, run and administer our elections, there is only so much that a White House can do in practice to actually manipulate the results of an election. They can certainly sow doubt about the legitimacy of an election, make people believe that the process is illegitimate, and it therefore falls on the American people to shut out the noise, to turn out and vote, to stay calm, to believe in their democratic processes, and if they believe those processes are being violated, to peacefully protest that violation. But the democratic roots in this country run very deep, and our adversaries, particularly Russia, want Americans to believe democracy isn't working, that we need to have some sort of movement away from this system of governance. And I don't believe that's true. I think we should be confident in our democracy, but also determined in our efforts to see to its furtherance.
So the guardrails are holding, in your view?
I think the guardrails are being tested. I think that this is an unprecedented moment. I don't think we've had a president who has said before that he would not commit to the peaceful transition of power, a president who has said that an election will be rigged, and a president who said that ballots should not be trusted. Let's be clear-eyed about the seriousness of this moment, but also not let that effort to make us distrust our processes cause apathy or resignation, because doing so would just play into the hands of those who want Americans to not believe in the sanctity of their electoral processes.
Yeah, and you've offered some solid assurance on the reality part of this equation, but that perception part, have tech companies done enough to clamp down on the easily spread misinformation that's coming from all directions?
So I think that clearly tech companies are devoting more resources to this issue, specifically on the subject of foreign interference. I think that in 2016, this threat was entirely overlooked by the private sector, as well as by, in large part, the US government, as to the idea that a foreign adversary could infect a social media environment in the way that Russia sought to do through the Internet Research Agency. I think now what we need is transparency continually from these social media companies. Congress should be seeking to oversee and regulate these companies. There's been nothing done on that front regarding regulation since 16, which I believe is unfortunate. And I think we should also see more public-private cooperation, as we've been seeing, where the FBI will say to Facebook, we see this account, we think it's linked to Russia, take it down. That's a great thing. I think that that's something that should continue. But I think we also should remember that this threat is not resolvable in the sense that it will never go away, because Vladimir Lenin, he interfered in elections around the world. Vladimir Putin's interfering in elections around the world. Elections are by nature penetrable because they're open and competitive. It's on us to manage this threat to influence voters, to secure our sovereignty as best we can, and to deter our adversaries from seeking to manipulate those processes. And that's something we can do, and I believe we should be doing. But I don't think it's a realistic goal to say that Facebook should take this down to literally zero in terms of foreign interference across its platform, because I don't believe that's an achievable goal. But I think we can get to as close as zero as is possible.
Given what you just said about the nature of the threat and the persistence of the threat, and that it's not going away and that it's not new, maybe it's new platforms and new strategies, but the idea of spreading disinformation and meddling is not new. Given that, what are the solutions? What are the specific solutions? Some people look at regulation and they want to treat the tech companies as if they are media companies and impose all of the same sort of standards that are imposed on the networks or other platforms. Others say the problem has to begin at the earliest ages and involve media education, or essentially fortifying individuals. How do you tackle the problem? What are your recommendations?
So I believe that to get at this threat, you need to get rid of the line between foreign and domestic policy, and you need a whole of nation, whole of government approach to seek to secure our sovereignty. Really, I think at home you need an effort to renew ourselves domestically. That is not only regarding securing our infrastructure, our actual voting systems. It's also about those steps I said with social media companies. It's about being less gullible to hack and dump operations and expecting reporters to focus on the source of those operations and the government to attribute them as quickly as possible. It involves investing, as you said, in education and local media to provide more of a shared reality for citizens, a sense of belonging where facts are not disputed at the most basic level. And it involves passing legislation and building a stronger democracy that is less polarized, so that there aren't so many fissures for our adversaries to exploit and blow up. But in conjunction with that, you also have to renew our nation abroad. You have to stand up to Russia and any of its fellow travelers, work with our fellow democracies who are also under siege to both detect and then punish those who engage in these sorts of operations. Because when we stand together and work together, that's much more effective than having every democracy stand on its own, as is happening now. I mean, I was struck in my research. I interviewed the president of Montenegro, whom Russian intelligence tried to assassinate, the former president of Colombia, who said his social media environment has been threatened by Russia. And so this is a global problem, and these other democracies stand alone at present, and that is a shame. And I think America should be stepping in to lead the way in seeking to say that democracies can and will be able to hold free and fair elections in the 21st century, that we now, new digital world that we now inhabit.
David, have you seen the documentary on Netflix, The Social Dilemma?
So I've been told to watch it. I have admittedly
Yeah.
not yet
I
watched
want to
it.
ask you, yeah, I would highly recommend it. It's a solid piece of reporting. One of the interviewees in the documentary, who's an expatriate from the tech world, who now is speaking out about the dangers. He says that we have about 20 years to fix this, that it represents an existential threat to democracies around the world. Is that hyperbole in your view? How much time do we have?
Sorry, fix what? What do you mean by this?
He talks about just that the impact social media has had on the ability to spread disinformation and to create these polarized environments where facts are really lost in the shuffle. That he views this as an existential threat to democracies that is directly tied to the rise of populist or even authoritarian leaders. I'm wondering, from someone who has studied it both historically and looking at the contemporary landscape, how you gauge the severity of the threat.
So I think that social media is just feeding into these problems that you're describing, and it is and they are serious problems, because when you live in a society that is so polarized as ours is, if you live in a democracy where so little legislation can be passed when two parties are in power in separate branches, where citizens don't believe parties are working together, they don't trust the other side, they don't share basic facts, it becomes astoundingly easy to sow division in that society, to manipulate citizens to get away with things that you might not be able to get away with, to test and in many ways violate the guardrails, as we discussed, that have so long helped to center our democratic system. So yes, I do think that we as a democracy need to figure out how to exist in a world that both has social media, but also has things like local media, fact-based journalism, fact-based information, reliable education about what it means to live in a digital democracy, so that citizens can reground themselves in this new world without giving up the technology that at this point I don't think is going away. We just have to figure out how to live with it in a more clear-eyed and level-headed way, which I agree we have not figured out how to do so far. And I think that over the ensuing years, the consequences of social media will become clearer. Although I would also make the counterpoint that we have yet to see how this social media age really affects autocratic systems, and how the internet ends up affecting autocratic systems, because we've seen in countries like Russia, protesters organize online, spread information online, and obviously those systems can control and censor their internet, or try to, in a much more direct, or can just do it at all, whereas America can and shouldn't. But I think that the story is playing out on both fronts, and it is yet to be seen what the ultimate consequences of that will be.
Well, stay tuned, and thank you for your ongoing contributions to the world of fact-based reporting. It's appreciated.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Yeah.
The book is Rigged: America, Russia, and 100 Years of Covert Electoral Interference. You just heard from the author, David Shimer, a global fellow with the Wilson Center's Kennan Institute. Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thanks to those of you who joined us either via the video or audio versions of Wilson Center Now today. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us again soon. A couple of weeks from the election, we hope you'll also get out and vote. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.